You're listening to the Future Tech Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Future technologies such as artificial intelligence, stem cells, 3D printing, gene editing, Bitcoin, blockchain, the microbiome, quantum computing, virtual reality, and exploring space are much closer than you might think. In fact, many early versions of these technologies are in play right now, and the companies that are using these technologies are the focus of this podcast. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a thorny medical problem. Remember, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and tell your friends about it. Thank you. Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Future Tech Health Podcast, and I have Minter Dial. He's the author of a book called Heartificial Empathy, Putting Heart into Business and AI. So, Minter, thanks for coming. How are you doing today?
My great pleasure, Rich. I'm speaking to you from Manhattan, where the sun is finally percolated.
Oh, okay. I'm from New York, so I've been there many a time. So, excellent. So, tell me about this book. Is it focused more on that, empathy and human touch is needed in the AI world, or is it just in general? Like, what's the focus of the book?
So let's say that the focus is on getting empathy to rise in any way that it can. So I went at it thinking that getting empathy to improve in a business environment would, A, improve business, and two, potentially have a knock-on effect on society, because I'm a big believer that business can help change society, and if it wants to, for the better. Then once I got into that, how do you encode empathy into a business? It became clear that there are some people, some avenues thinking that it should be something we integrate into artificial intelligence, either because that's good for business, or B, because we don't know how to do it ourselves.
Well, I guess the goal is to have it be both good for business, and then there's a big incentive for it to be put in place,
Absolutely. Well, ultimately, it's good for society that we should have more empathy, because many studies indicate that there has been a drop in the amount of empathy perceived by people over the last couple of decades. On the other hand,
I perceive it all the time. A lot of stuff's automated now, and I hate it. I don't want to go to a tablet and type stuff in, or you go to your doctor, they're like, here, sign in on this computer, and there's no empathy there. And, you get an email confirmation from someone and there's no empathy there. Or, you sign up for a lot of these businesses and you can't talk to anybody. Like Uber, it's just like this invisible machine thing. How can there be any empathy in that? So I definitely feel a tremendous reduction in it, and I don't like it.
Well, so on the one hand, you have the automation component of it, but actually the field or the area where the empathy has dropped, which is far more worrisome as far as I'm concerned, is the people. So independent of the app and the automated telephone service, it's the inability of people to be empathic with one another, either as colleagues or with customers. And then obviously in the bigger society, with the people that you meet in the street who are strangers. And the issue then becomes, if we're not able to be empathic as human beings, how on earth can we properly code a machine, because we don't know what it is in the first place?
Yeah, why do you think that people become, colder and less considerate of others? I would think the opposite would happen, but I guess you're right. I thought it's just where I live, but I don't know. Maybe it's everywhere. What are your thoughts?
Well, so I'm using as much as I can the studies that I look at. And I'm going to give you the numbers in a moment. But I think on the one hand, there is potentially a greater awareness of what empathy is. And so we now given it a name, and people are more aware of it, like some of these diseases one has. And on the other hand, there are some components or factors that have impacted our ability to have civility and spend time listening to somebody else's story. So the big statistic that I have referred to a lot, and I think is an appropriate one, is a study out of the University of Michigan, which was done 9 years ago now. And that study was done with 14,000 college kids who were graduating. And they asked to self-evaluate on their empathy. And then they had done the same study 30 years ago. And in the second study in 2010, the kids of the same age, but 30 years later, self-identified them as being 40% less empathic than their peers of 30 years ago.
Well, what does that mean, less empathic? It means, can you tie that to a specific situation or response? Or how would someone be rated that way, and how would someone feel that way about themselves or about someone else? What are the things that go into that evaluation?
Well, on the big hand is the ability to be understood. And so as an individual, the perception of someone else being empathic towards them is largely categorized as feeling understood. And so that's as a recipient of someone else's empathy. And in today's world, with the acceleration or perceived acceleration of time and the consternation around devices and obsession, if you will, around devices of all sorts, you've got an environment where people just don't feel like they have the time or want to dedicate the time to properly interact with one another, have a strong heart-to-heart, even if there's no specific measurable output desired. It's just that opportunity to listen intensely to what the other person's saying or feeling, and to perceive it, and then not to jump in with like, oh, well, I'll tell you my story, but actually just hear out the other person's story. And today, whether it's an increase in narcissism, a reduction in time, or an obsession with technology, there are many reasons why people are understanding themselves to be and seeming to feel that there's less empathy out there.
Do people perceive that certain groups are less empathetic or more empathetic? Like men are getting worse, women are getting worse, men are getting better. I don't know. Are there certain regions that appear to give a shit more or less?
Well, there's probably more research that I haven't read, because obviously it's a large topic and there's a vast number of thoughts with regard to that. So I don't necessarily speak to the truth, but I do have a strong belief and some numbers that back it up that show that, generally speaking, and this is something that I would call natural as opposed to inculcated or culture, to women to be more empathic than men. Or if we were to put it another way, the feminine versus the masculine. And the notion is that the ability to listen intensely means I'm prepared to make abstraction of myself and fully engage in the emotions that the other person is experiencing and forget myself, if you will, at some level. And there's three things that would tend to prove out what has always been an intuition of mine. And the one is that from a DNA standpoint, there's a portion of a genetic composition that only exists in women who are seen as being empathic. In other words, this genetic variant does not exist in men. And so there's a reason to believe that we have a genetic predisposition one way or the other. The second is a brain wiring phenomenon where in men, more often than in women, a third part of the brain will trigger out when I'm listening to somebody's story. And that third part of the brain is, well, how does that relate to a story that I have lived? So the issue is then you start, taking the story, and I'm going to stop listening to Richard, and I'm going to start thinking only about my story, which is not at all being empathic, although you might think you are. But that is typically that's something that triggers only in the masculine brain.
Yeah, I mean, my response is to try to solve a problem. When someone has an issue, it's hard for me to just sit there and listen, because I guess it's just not me. Like, I think men also want to solve problems and jump in there, and women are better at just listening and saying, oh, I'm sorry to hear that. That's terrible. But for me, that doesn't really feel like it does anything. So I have to jump in, I feel like.
Exactly right. And that's a typical reaction. At the end of the day, you think you're being kind to the other person, but the challenge is actually A, understanding the real problems behind it, and B, believing that actually listening is an action. Because if you jump in and provide a solution, like you, if you've ever read Women Are From Mars and Women Are From Venus and Men Are From Mars, or I think a much better book, You Just Don't Understand When Men and Women in Conversation, written by Dr. Deborah Tannen. The notion of jumping in with an action. Well, wait a second. Let's say in a caricatured situation, the woman says, "I got a situation, I got a problem." The man jumps in and says, "Well, here's the hammer to hit the nail." She says, "Well, don't you think I knew that I could figure that out?" She says, "All I wanted you to do was listen to my problem." And that act of listening is higher degree of empathy. The notion of the action that follows has nothing to do with empathy. That is compassion, that is an action, that is being sympathetic, but it really is impeding your ability to be empathic because you're thinking, while I'm talking, well, here's what I'm going to do. And so you're not actually fundamentally listening. You're jumping to a solution which A, might not be required or desired, and two, might not be the right one because you haven't fully listened.
Yeah, it's hard not to.
Indeed, I agree.
But I see what you mean. It just seems like the listening, like, what's the good of that, But I know this is back to the men and women conversation, but I think, all right, so I listen to you, but I guess I feel like if I tell someone something and they don't really respond and they just listen, then I feel like they're not listening. So I guess I feel the opposite, like, what do you think about what I just said? And, if they say, oh, I was just listening, then I'm like, okay, so what do you think about what I just said? And for me, it feels like the opposite is helpful.
That is probably what I would characterize as not properly listening, because ultimately good listening in an exchange with two people includes reformulating. So if you're saying that, Rich, what you're just saying, it seems like if you are speaking to somebody and they're not replying back to you, then you feel like they're not listening. So what I'm doing right now is I'm listening to you with greater rephrasing, but I'm not providing you a solution. I'm just impressing upon you that I've actually understood what you just said. And then once you feel like you're understood, then you continue on. And the next thing it does me this and I do that. And then your ability to continue to dive into your feelings actually goes deeper because I'm with you. I'm going down your rabbit hole. You've got this issue. I'm with you. And I got your back. Oh, that's what this is. And then while I reformulate it, allows you to think a little bit more. And that is actually very therapeutic.
It sounds like it, yeah. That's good. So when you reported people experiencing less empathy, was it the people reporting about themselves or about their interactions with others? And who was reporting that? Young people, old people, men, women? Is there any skew to what the reporting looked like?
All right. So the study that I referred to at University of Michigan was with college students, so young 20, 21, 22-year-olds. In another survey that I did, and that was self-reporting, so that I feel that I am less empathic in the main. I'd done another survey, and this is a survey that was far more broad. And although I don't have a strict sociodemographic breakdown, this survey looked at where other areas of empathy was being either increased or decreased, and so one was a general feeling that empathy had decreased. 60% of the individuals who replied to this questionnaire felt that empathy has decreased over the last 10 years. Only 20%, 22% to be exact, believed that it had increased over the last 10 years. Another component was evaluating the amount of empathy within business. And empathy within business was seen as being more than 10% less than empathy, and that's sort of amongst your colleagues, than empathy within regular society, for example, at home. And then worse yet was the amount of empathy that companies were demonstrating to customers. And I didn't qualify whether it was through machines or people, but in general. And I think that the issue is that in reality, the vast majority of our interactions are still with people, whether you're going into a store or calling a helpline. There's on balance still a majority that's happening through people if you think about all the interactions. And that's the feeling, is that people in business are so stressed that they don't have time to listen out your issue or provide you with a personalized answer that satisfies fully your situation. And so they are being penalized for that, which is why, amongst other things, you see much less loyalty to businesses because, well, they don't really care about me. sometimes the transaction works. Sometimes I feel pissed off. If I feel pissed off, I'll move along.
Right, exactly. Yeah. How about in medical care? Talk about a lack of empathy. At least from my perspective, doctors having no time to talk to you, and I don't know. It just seems like there's none there.
Well, I tend to agree, and it's interesting because naturally in healthcare, empathy is something they do talk about and try to include into the syllabus to teach doctors and nurses. On the other hand, reality is empathy takes time. And in an environment where we're constantly looking for efficiencies and we impose 10-minute limits on the amount of time that a doctor has with each of its patients, for example, in the NHS in England, it's very hard to be, on the one hand, empathic and effective and stay within 10 minutes. And I believe that if they were to review this and consider empathy and the time that it takes, they surely would get to better solutions and therefore longer term, better healthcare.
So what are the obvious and the non-obvious consequences of a drop in empathy across all sectors?
Non-obvious in a Rohit Bagarva way. Let's say in the obvious manners, empathy is an incredibly important tool in design. And to the extent that you're designing a product, a web page, or any user experience, the ability to think in the shoes of the others is radically important. The non-obvious statements first. I don't really think that empathy should and could be applied everywhere. So one needs to think strategically about how you're imposing or putting empathy into your business and think where strategically it can do the most benefit. Because if, like the doctor, you end up spending all of your time listening and doing nothing, you will quickly go out of business. So you need, and again, in this case, in business, sitting and listening only really won't satisfy. But according much more time to listening to customers' needs, observing how they act, and then acting, you surely will get a much better return on investment. So that's the first non-obvious thing. The second non-obvious thing is that in business, we're typically run by more successful, therefore better paid CEOs. They're successful. They are at the head of the company probably for a reason. And success breeds a certain level of arrogance. And it's been proven that affluence breeds a certain lack of empathy. And so the notion behind that is, the rich feel they don't have to be empathic. They sort of feel that they are my way or the highway. And to the extent that that's a profile of the person who's leading the company, it becomes even harder. So the issue then becomes self-awareness at the top side of the company as to whether they really are prepared to make the changes themselves before trying to tell all of their employees to be more empathic with their customers.
So any recommendations that have come from, your analysis and, that are in your book?
Oh, well, there certainly are. And good news is there are some solutions.
So without spoiling it, what can you say? I know you don't.
Of course. No. I don't. It's okay. There's so much in there. And, I really get plunged into this notion of putting empathy into AI and so much more. So it's a complex thing. So let's say that the first thing I recommend as a company, if you've decided that empathy, that could really be improving our ability for design and customer satisfaction and performance in general, is to take a good old look at your culture and put a mirror up about the level of empathy of the senior team. Because if you intellectually understand that empathy is a good thing, you and I, Rich, get this, and all right, cool, that's really what we want. But actually, we aren't, or we don't have the bandwidth for it, or really give a shit enough to do it, then the chances of any program that we put in place happening or working at least over a period of time are generally going to tend to zero.
You have to lead with whatever you want to have happen. You have to lead. It includes showing empathy, demonstrating.
Absolutely. I think all change, that is a rule of thumb. And we are talking about change because business schools, historic, have never been including in their syllabi courses on how to be more empathic as a leader. It's sort of soft tissue and namby-pamby stuff. And in balance, it's not a word that you will have heard coming up through the ranks in any of these large companies. It's beginning to be the case, but basically it's foreign affairs as far as companies is concerned. So lead by example. And then afterwards, there are, depending on your culture and what you're trying to achieve, getting into the shoes of the customers just makes sense. It's remarkable how many times the user experience is devoid of facility, inconvenience because of different processes or an ugly path towards, or too many clicks. And these reasons come because the company has legal team, or the company has a lot of different departments vying for space on the site, or whatever the reasons are. But if you could literally get into the shoes of the customer and go through the process without being recognized as the CEO, for example, then you might be much closer to understanding the frustrations that you were talking about, Rich, before, when you call up the phone and you have this infinite loop and piss and horrible pain on an automated service. Because if a CEO calls, generally speaking, that flashes up on the customer service number. CEO's calling, and they immediately answer and they immediately get his phone. So you need to do it in a way that's like a customer, so they're unrecognizable as a member of the company, and then see what that feels like. That's an example of actually walking in the customer's shoes.
So what do you think is what does the future hold for empathy? Do you think it'll continue downwards and then bounce back because it gets quote unquote too low, or what do you think is going to happen?
Well, I think that we're in a situation in society, if that's where the bellwether is, and because that's what's most important in life, where there's so much division, it becomes part of a bigger question as to whether we as a country, which country we're living in, we care to bridge the gap with the other side. And I mean right with left and left with right, generally speaking, if we're talking in the United States, but it's the other side. And there's a lot of divisiveness. And so the desire to listen to the other side right now, I don't hear it. I don't see it, whether it's in the media or in society. And while the people within your ecosystem, in your glass bowl, might be showing empathy to one another, the real challenge is showing empathy to people who don't think like you. That's where the real challenge is. And in order to do that, you have to want to do it and understand why you're doing it. And to date, I don't see a unifying factor in society that's really there to encourage us to want to get out of that comfort zone and go walk in the shoes of somebody who is maybe in a very disadvantaged situation, a homeless person, or, meet somebody, if you're from the left, who's a far right winger. And, there's right now it's more,
the polarization of politics, that's another factor that seems to have reduced empathy big time on both sides,
Absolutely. And so right now, if I had to answer whether empathy is going to improve, I would say no. And which is why I was so keen on also exploring putting empathy into artificial intelligence, since if intellectually we might yet decide that empathy is a good way to improve my business, therefore, I'll put it into the artificial intelligence. Of course, that's a very difficult task to do. But I do believe that there's going to be a greater focus on increasingly being more automated, of course, using artificial intelligence. And therefore, when people intellectually get it, well, all I need to do is code it. The issue or the challenge I lay down is that if you delegate your empathy, the chances are it will not work. It's like the roll of the eyes of the employee when the boss says, you should all be really nice, and he gets out a whip and he whips everybody. You can just feel the lethargy and the entropy when the culture internally is discordant with what we're trying to achieve with customers. So you need to be congruent in the way you're trying to do this, and just delegating empathy into an AI when you internally do not have that as a culture, you're going to make a lot of mistakes. And when I argue, it would all fail and implode. So that's why I was really looking at that notion of putting empathy into AI. And the intention behind it, of course, is to do it better. but also to put up a mirror to say, why do you want to encode empathy into a machine, and are you capable?
I wonder if anyone's done this, if they've tracked, an empathy index in certain countries or in the world and correlated that with events. Like I wonder what empathy looked like from 1900 up to like 1945 or 1950, with the two world wars, all the things that went on. It'd just be interesting to see if someone was able to figure that out somehow.
Well, I don't think that war as a general activity is good for laying down greater empathy, because ultimately it's about knowing the other side better. The more we do know the other side better, the less feeling we may feel that we're worried about them or, fearful, and we can build bridges.
I mean, imagine, again, before World War II in Europe and the various countries, what if you saw that there was a steady decline in empathy, and that's what precipitated the war, for instance? And what if you saw that in multiple instances? Maybe there's a correlation to be found there. As the societies become less empathetic, they tend towards these things, or they end up in war. Historically, it'd just be interesting to contemplate something like that. And is there a big rebounding of empathy after a war, or no? Just my thought.
Yeah, no, totally. I love it. Of course, we'd have to probably retrofit some, going back to re-understand it, because in any event, there's also a big challenge, Rich, which is how do you actually measure empathy? So even in any of the studies that one does, normalizing the definition and the standard and how we're measuring it, it's awfully complicated. And there's a whole lot of subjectivity to the feeling of, receiving empathy and so on. There is, by the way, an index that was done a couple of years ago out of the UK, where a team from the south of the UK created an empathic index for companies. And the index looked at 170 publicly traded companies, and with a battery of some 50 criteria, which together allowed you to establish the empathic index of the company, they were able to determine that the top 10 companies outperformed the bottom 10 by 2 times on the stock market.
Interesting. Well, I guess I can tell you about one more experience I had. I don't know how this fits in, but I took my family to Japan a year or so ago, and I noticed there was a much greater human presence. You go to shops, there's people around, it's far less machines. There were just people everywhere. And people were very nice and guided you around and all that. So, that's one big thing I noticed is I like the human touch. I like having a lot more people around, even to do simple things, like my son and I went to a department store and we asked where the Pokemon area was. And this one guard, he goes, "Oh, Pokemon Center." And he took us there and guided us and bowed and showed us the Pokemon Center. And you just feel really good, So it was a very cool experience. And, then we came back to like Chicago or something, and the people there were all surly and, they're like, they don't give a shit if you live or die. So it does have a big effect on you. The being in a nice culture where people are at least pleasant and helpful instead of, surly and uncaring.
And I agree. And the notion leads to civility, because in the end of the day, they don't have to be nice to you. And some of them do because it's their business. But the security guard didn't have to go out of his way to show you the Pokemon Center. You might just have a feeling of national pride, of course. But at the same time, that notion of civility, respect to one another, it makes me feel that in our incivility that we're experiencing in daily life, and I think it's a general feeling because the Japanese also have, or none the same, a feeling that civility has declined for the Japanese as well. You've got this notion of ethics, and the link between empathy and ethics is also very important. And so the ethics is I want to do good as a principle, or I know the difference between good and bad. And if we only want to do good by the people we like, in other words, the like-minded folks, but we're not interested in spreading that generosity, if you will, with other people who think differently, then that sort of targeted empathy and the miscuing of ethics, therefore going down to a lack of diversity because only my type are the right types. I might be empathic to those types, but I'm not wanting to reach out to the others. Let's say a tourist that comes in, or someone who looks different from me. And so the ethical construct and is highly linked to the empathy story. And again, I don't want to be a tyrannist when it comes to, or tyrannical about being empathic all the time, because it's asking yourselves and myself anyway to a standard I can't live up to all the time. But it's about being more empathic and introducing empathy as much as we can. And certainly there are some cultures that have it better. And where I was thinking about that was respect for the older and living with the older. We're in a society in America and England where old people, they're a pain in the butt. Move them out, send them to a retirement home, community home, hospice, get them out. Whereas in the Asian culture, or in a lot of third world cultures where you can't afford any other thing, you do end up living with multiple generations in a house. And that shared wisdom, the youth explaining new tech to the old telling them stories about before the war, and respecting and understanding how we get old, naturally leads you to feel a little bit more empathic at some level. Of course, you can have dystopian versions of this and unhappy families. Yet, by living with people who are of a different generation, you are naturally learning their context.
That's true. Yeah. Instead of, like you said, throwing them into old age homes or just hanging around with people of your own age only. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. So what's so in the book, does it give a prescription for happiness or for finding more empathy, or what's the summation of the book? Is it just like, here's what is, or is it give you helpful hints on how to improve your life?
Well, it does a little bit of everything. It's only a 200-page book, so it's reasonably short. The main gist is to encourage people to have more empathy. So not 100%, but just to have more. If you're at 1, let's move to 2. If you're at 10, let's move to 20, whatever. And then with that, try to prove from a very business-minded perspective why it would be beneficial to you. So there's a benefit proven of higher engagement of your employees. There's a benefit proven of better design. There's certainly a benefit that's hard to imagine isolatedly equate with, but higher customer service satisfaction. So once you get into the business framework and say, oh, darn, this is actually going to be good for my bottom line, then hopefully I've explored and opened the big why you need to be doing it. And by the way, you'll also find people more satisfied, happier, more engaged within your organization. And ultimately, that means more employee loyalty. And that's not going to be a bad thing. Of course, if you got a bunch of dummies, you've got another problem. Yet, I think that the inclination of the book is, why do we need to have more empathy? About how much it's just about increasing empathy. And then the last half of the book really looks at how to encode empathy into a machine and how that can be instructive for us, both from just the sheer learning of it, but also how it reflects back. And it forces us to really understand what is empathy from our standpoint. How do you want to dissect that into behaviors? Because those behaviors then become code and specific responses to inputs that you're going to experience when you're chatting with a bot or whatever.
Yeah, that's interesting. I imagine programming a bot to respond and by interrupting and just telling its own stories, and then you program a bot to listen and say, I've heard you, and reformulate what they've said, and then give some constructive feedback, and you could literally test it probably pretty easily. How'd you feel about this interaction? The bot pissed me off, or actually I felt like it was good. So I think it's very testable.
It is. You're right. And of course it's testable, and it's very difficult, because to appropriately listen to what you've said, reformulate it in a way that, instead of just repeating robot manner, the words you used, and get that feeling of being heard in a humane way is even that is still a little bit more difficult. And then underneath that is to understand the emotions that are coming through that, not just what you said, but what that makes you feel. And so pulling out of the facts that you describe, the feelings that you feel, because in the end of the day, it's about understanding, but also understanding what you feel about it. Because if I said to you, my cat's not here. Well, that could mean a number of
Your
things.
cat's not there?
Yeah, well, just whatever. I say something, but you don't know what I really feel about that. My cat's not here. That's great because I'm very allergic to cats.
I am. Yeah.
Or, well, so am I. Or my cat's not here because I really love my cat and I'm very upset. So there is an example of one phrase that has two very different potential meanings. And until the robot can determine that, it can misconstrue and misunderstand what's being meant. So it's more complicated. And yet, I think that you're right. If we were able to show, provide a bot whose agency is to interrupt, and another one who is designed to listen and reformulate, the chances are that the second one's going to come out with a better output. But of course, at the end of the day, you called for a reason, and that is that my item came broken. I want it replaced, and so you also need to have the agency to replace it. And ultimately, at least for the medium term, the chances are that will only be achievable with a bot plus human.
Yeah, I guess I can, I guess I'm interrupting giving my own stories, but I'm not sure what else to do. But I can tell you a couple more stories about my interactions that may be useful to you and listeners. But one is, it's funny, Walgreens pharmacy. So if I call and I want to speak to a pharmacist, the automated system literally goes, okay, let me get you to someone that can help. And I feel patronized because they programmed the system to sound like that. I swear to God, that's what it sounds like. And I'm like, what, okay, fuck you, transfer me. That's what I think.
Right.
So it's funny. It's like a misapplication of empathy, or I don't even know if they thought about that, So
yeah, well, they may be just trying to humanize it, but they don't have the right tone.
Yeah, it was just funny that, and I even though it was a robot saying it to me, I still reacted emotionally. So it's interesting that AI, I guess, done well or not done well, will still affect the people it interacts with big time,
Well, if we could just stop on that 1 second, Rich, which is to say, in my study, I asked whether people could feel emotions for a machine. And the vast majority, 60%, said yes, absolutely.
Yeah, makes sense. And then, I guess one other business example is, we go to this one restaurant a lot. And the last time we were there, my younger daughter, took off her shoes, So the waiter comes up and says to my wife, "Excuse me, ma'am, you can't be in here with no shoes on." And she was like, "What?" And, we didn't realize my younger daughter, who was 8, took off her shoes, And my wife was so embarrassed and pissed off, she walked out, and we just settled the bill and left. And they were like, "I'm sorry, that's the policy." I said, "You did it in totally the wrong way. Totally the wrong way. You embarrassed my wife." I said, "We don't want to come back here anymore. And we spent a lot of money at your restaurant." And they're like, "It's the policy. No empathy, no nothing. So we don't go back there anymore." And they're going to lose over a year, probably several $1,000s of our business because they just don't care. So empathy does have now that I think about it, it has a huge role on how people interact with businesses.
Yeah, and in that particular case, the issue is that policy was written probably by someone at headquarters who, let's say, had an initial intention might have been good. Well, we don't want to have dirt. We want to have very clean. So no cigarettes, no bare feet, no this and that. And that was the policy. So they came from somewhere which wasn't about attacking your child. But in the implementation, you should allow the agency or for the individuals who are at the customer coalface to say, well, that seems like a very acceptable route. She's got her feet, she's tucked them underneath her legs or whatever, and It's just an 8-year-old. And so this is silly. I'm not going to say anything about it. That's writing policies. You can explain them better. And 2, you should review them from the customer standpoint. As on the one hand, you might have this conflicting idea of wanting to have complete cleanliness. On the other hand, total happiness. And so you need to make a call, and they made the wrong call.
Yeah, and then they didn't apologize or anything. They just kept saying robots. It's the policy. It's the policy. They couldn't say "I'm totally sorry. I know this is ridiculous, but our hands are tied or whatever. Just we value you being here. Please come back. Here's a coupon. Something. None of that. Nothing. So we were like, goodbye.
Absolutely. And they should suffer for that. Well done. Stand up to it.
Well, very good, Mitch. So now that you've heard me out and shown me empathy, I appreciate it. But for listeners, what are some resources for them so they can get your book, Amazon, and where can they get your book, and where can they find out more about you and connect with you somehow?
Thanks for asking, Rich. So the book, I've decided to distribute it uniquely through Amazon. It's available as an audio book, a Kindle, and a paper book on Amazon in your country, pretty much, as Amazon is available. And otherwise, I write about 2 blog posts a week. I've been and I've got a podcast which I've been doing for 10 years myself. And nice. Those can all be found on minterdial.com. And otherwise, the final thing probably is my little old Twitter handle, MDIAL. MDIAL.
Okay. Well, very good. Well, Minter, it's been a great call. I really appreciate you coming on the podcast.
Many thanks for having me on, Rich. Look forward to staying in touch.
You're listening to the Future Tech Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Future technologies such as artificial intelligence, stem cells, 3D printing, gene editing, Bitcoin, blockchain, the microbiome, quantum computing, virtual reality, and exploring space are much closer than you might think. In fact, many early versions of these technologies are in play right now, and the companies that are using these technologies are the focus of this podcast. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a thorny medical problem. Remember, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and tell your friends about it. Thank you.